Take after, does he look like anyone?
We're still trying to figure that out.
Everyone says that babies change so much over 2 weeks. We're basically sort of monitoring how the changing process happens over this next month, really. But his looks are changing every single day,
Yeah.
so who knows?
Prince William has once again found himself at the center of attention, as new developments begin to draw renewed focus on long-standing questions and legal discussions connected to the royal sphere. At the same time, separate reports and online conversations have been circulating about Meghan Markle, with some recent content and past narratives being brought back into public debate. While these topics are not directly linked, the timing has caused many observers to connect the dots and speculate about a wider story unfolding.
Scandal comes as no surprise. Speculation about the children has been simmering for years.
Adding to this, a complex legal case involving inheritance laws and historical frameworks has resurfaced, raising broader questions about how tradition and modern realities intersect. As these discussions begin to overlap, it's created a situation that has captured significant attention, leaving many wondering how or if these threads are connected at all. One of the key discussions that has resurfaced revolves around long-standing questions about royal protocols and how certain rules are interpreted today. In particular, there has been renewed online debate about the phrase "born of the body," which is often referenced in relation to historical succession guidelines.
Markle has been incredibly quiet about the birth, but mostly the pregnancy of these children. Everything has been shady. The one who's been blabbing and saying crazy things is Prince Harry.
It's important to note that much of this conversation is driven by speculation rather than verified information, but it has gained traction as new legal stories emerge. Recently, a separate high-profile inheritance case involving an aristocratic family has drawn attention after details about surrogacy and legal heir status were brought before a UK court. The case highlights how older laws are now being re-examined in modern contexts. While this situation is not directly connected to the Sussex family, some observers are linking the broader implications, raising questions about how tradition and legal interpretation continue to evolve. At the center of this case is a significant inheritance, reportedly worth millions, governed by legal language that dates back decades, long before modern definitions and family structures were widely recognized. Because of that, certain terms used in these trusts are now being closely examined.
Something is happening right now in the courts, which is incredibly important, and nobody's paying attention to it because this will make history, and not in a good way for Meghan Markle.
Particularly how they apply in situations involving surrogacy. In court, it was acknowledged that there is still legal uncertainty around how these older frameworks should be interpreted in today's context. The case has drawn attention not because of the individuals involved alone, but because it highlights a broader issue: how traditional legal wording can struggle to keep up with modern realities. For many observers, it raises an important question. When laws are built on outdated definitions, how should they be applied in a world that has clearly evolved beyond them? What has made this case particularly significant is the broader conversation it has sparked around long-standing legal principles, especially those tied to inheritance and succession. Some commentators have pointed out that certain traditional phrases, such as those historically used in royal and legal frameworks, have existed for centuries and continue to influence how eligibility is defined. Because of this,
I'm going to quote Tom Bauer by saying, he said, "Look, we all laughed at Samantha and she was right, and everything she said has come true."
the discussion has expanded beyond a single case, with some observers drawing parallels to how similar language has been used in royal contexts over time. However, it's important to emphasize that these comparisons are largely speculative and not based on any confirmed legal challenge involving the Sussex family. Still, the situation has highlighted how deeply rooted these traditional definitions are, and how complex it can be to interpret them in a modern world where circumstances have evolved significantly. In many discussions, people often point to how strict and consistent these traditional rules have historically been, with very little room for interpretation or exception. That consistency is part of what makes current conversations feel so significant to some observers. At the same time, public figures like Meghan Markle continue to generate strong and often divided opinions. Some critics question the level of transparency surrounding certain topics.
Put an article out there that Meghan had a hysterectomy and couldn't have children, and that was a big issue in their relationship. So that says a lot to the fake royal kids right now, because obviously they couldn't have come out of her. So that's something that she obviously is going to have to deal with.
While supporters argue that much of the scrutiny goes beyond what is reasonable or fair. There have also been reports of legal responses to media coverage and public claims, which is not uncommon for high-profile individuals managing their image in a highly visible environment. Ultimately, what we're seeing is a clash between perception and control, where public curiosity meets the realities of reputation management in the modern media landscape. And this is where the conversation starts to shift from individual cases to a much broader issue. When legal systems, media narratives, and public curiosity all intersect, even unrelated stories can begin to feel connected. For some observers, the real question isn't about one specific claim, but about consistency, how rules are applied, how information is shared, and how much transparency is expected from public figures. Others argue that drawing these comparisons goes too far, especially when there is no confirmed legal link between the situations being discussed. Still, the overlap in timing and themes has been enough to keep the discussion alive, turning what could have been a separate legal matter into part of a much wider public conversation. Another topic that continues to surface in online discussions is the level of public transparency surrounding royal births.
When the baby was born, when Archie was born, that was another, in my view, a disaster, because I knew we was not going to get a picture of it. Everybody was hoping we would get pictures.
Particularly when compared across different members of the family. Some observers point out how previous royal births were handled in a very visible and traditional way, with official announcements, public appearances, and clearly documented timelines. In contrast, others note that more recent approaches have been more private, which has led to ongoing curiosity and, at times, speculation. It's important to emphasize that no verified information has challenged the official records, but the difference in approach has still sparked conversation. For many, the discussion isn't about claims or theories, it's about expectations. How much transparency should be required, and does a more private approach naturally invite more public questions? When Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was born in May 2019, the announcement marked a notable shift in how royal births were presented to the public. Unlike previous traditions, such as the hospital steps photo call or detailed medical notices, this moment was handled with a more private approach. Official information was still released, but the process looked different from what many had been used to seeing in earlier royal events. Prince Harry later shared aspects of the experience in his memoir, describing how quickly everything moved following the birth. Those details added to the sense that this was a departure from long-established patterns. For some observers, the contrast
wants all of the privileges that go along with an identity, but she doesn't want any of the responsibilities. She doesn't want to do any of the work. She wants the tiara, she doesn't want the public service.
Stood out and raised questions about changing traditions. For others, it was simply a reflection of a couple choosing more privacy. Either way, it became one of the most talked about differences in recent royal history. For centuries, royal births have often been treated as moments of public significance, not just as family events, but as part of a broader constitutional tradition. Because of that history, any shift in how these moments are presented naturally draws attention. In this case, the more private approach taken stood out to some observers as a clear departure from past precedent, while others viewed it as a modern update to long-standing traditions. Additional details shared later by Prince Harry, including more personal and intimate elements surrounding the birth, also contributed to the conversation. For some, these details reflected a more individual and contemporary perspective. For others, they felt notably different from the formal tone typically associated with royal announcements. Ultimately, the contrast between tradition and personalization is what continues to keep this topic part of.
He's had enough. He wants to clean the monarchy, and it's all now in the hands of the courts. Meghan Markle is in full mode panic along with Harry because they both know what they did.
Ongoing public discussion. The birth of their daughter in 2021 brought similar discussions back into focus, especially as more personal details were shared publicly afterward. In his memoir, Prince Harry described the experience in a very hands-on and emotional way, offering a perspective that felt far more intimate than traditional royal accounts. For many readers, those details came across as personal and meaningful, reflecting a modern approach to parenthood. At the same time, some observers once again pointed out how different this was from historical royal practices, where formal structure and official documentation played a larger role. This contrast has continued to fuel conversation, not necessarily about the events themselves, but about how evolving personal choices intersect with long-established traditions.
It's actually torture to listen to that woman now, because every other word out of her mouth is a lie.
That have defined royal protocol for generations. Another point often raised in these discussions is how different modern royal births can appear compared to historical practices. In earlier generations, certain formalities, such as official witnesses and structured announcements, were part of long-established protocol. In more recent years, however, there has been a noticeable shift toward greater privacy, with less emphasis on those traditional elements. While official information has still been provided, the format and level of public detail have evolved. Some observers see this as a natural modernization of royal life, reflecting changing expectations around privacy. Others feel that when it comes to roles connected to tradition and public interest, clarity and consistency remain important. This difference in perspective is what continues to fuel debate, especially when historical precedent and modern choices don't fully align. This is where the discussion becomes more divided. Some commentators argue that if everything is clear,
Meghan actually refused to use the hospital that was usually used by royals and refused to use all of the normal medical staff, and there was all of the weirdness over the timing of the birth of Archie.
then a more direct and simple explanation would naturally put many of these questions to rest. At the same time, others point out that public figures are not obligated to respond to every claim or speculation, especially when it involves deeply personal matters like family and children. There have also been reports suggesting that different members of the royal family may have their own views on how certain situations have been handled. However, these claims largely come from unnamed sources and should be treated as part of ongoing media discussion rather than confirmed fact. Ultimately, the situation highlights a broader tension between public curiosity and the right to privacy, and where that line should be drawn. What makes this situation even more complex is how quickly conversations can escalate when multiple sensitive topics overlap: royal tradition, legal frameworks, and personal family matters. For some observers, these discussions raise broader questions about how institutions adapt to modern realities. For others, they feel the focus has shifted too far into speculation without clear evidence to support it. At the same time, the lack of a single, universally accepted narrative means that different interpretations continue to circulate, each gaining traction with different audiences. And in an environment like this, where information, opinion, and assumption often blend together,
the stories would come out. So apparently, according to other journalists, we found out that there were a lot of porcupines probably told to the royals and even to Harry when they met her. And in order to cover up,
it becomes increasingly difficult to separate what is known from what is simply being debated. At the same time, some royal watchers point out that actions in recent years suggest a gradual distancing between the Sussex brand and the monarchy's official identity. Mentions on official platforms have changed, roles have shifted, and the boundaries between public duty and private ventures continue to evolve. For critics, one of the biggest frustrations is what they see as a contradiction: public criticism of the institution alongside continued use of royal titles in branding and media appearances. That tension has become a central talking point in online discussions. Supporters, however, argue that titles are part of formal identity and not something easily separated from public life, especially when global recognition is involved. They see it less as hypocrisy and more as a complex transition between two very different worlds. And that divide in interpretation is exactly why conversations like this keep gaining momentum. Because depending on where you stand, the same actions can look either strategic or inconsistent. And this is where the conversation moves from speculation into something more concrete:
about this. So she is right now going through the legal process because as per the Peerage Act of 1963, that child born in the United States from a surrogate is not entitled to anything, inheritance or anything.
Because the Marquis of Bath case isn't built on rumors or online theories, it's happening inside a courtroom under real legal scrutiny. He has been open about using surrogacy, open about his son, and clear about one thing. He wants to protect his child's rights within a system that wasn't designed for modern family structures. And that's the key issue. The legal framework in question was written long before surrogacy, IVF, or any of today's realities even existed. So now courts are being asked to interpret old definitions, like inheritance rules and eligibility, through a modern lens. For many observers, this isn't just about one family. It highlights a much bigger question about how traditional systems adapt when society changes. And once that question is raised in one high-profile case, people naturally start wondering where else those same legal definitions might apply, and whether they still hold up today. Mr. Justice Matthews made it clear in his remarks that the current legal framework doesn't automatically account for situations like this.
Everybody and just produce a DNA sample or proof of delivery. If you had those things, it would be very easy just to put them out there and say, this is what happened. This is what it is.
Instead, it requires formal steps, applications, reviews, and ultimately a court decision to determine how those rules should apply in modern circumstances. And that's where the contrast becomes important. In private inheritance cases, families can go to court, present their arguments, and potentially have arrangements clarified or adjusted. It's a legal process, but it's flexible enough to evolve. But when people start comparing that to constitutional structures, the conversation becomes far more complex, because those frameworks, built over centuries, aren't easily changed or reinterpreted on a case-by-case basis. They rely on long-standing definitions and formal processes that carry much wider implications. So for many observers, this isn't just about one legal case. It opens up a broader discussion about how historic systems respond to modern realities, and whether existing definitions are still fit for purpose today. And this is exactly where the debate starts to intensify.
Did Buckingham Palace or Prince William set a trap for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and were they gullible enough to fall into it?
Because once legal systems begin facing modern situations they weren't originally designed for, it creates a ripple effect far beyond a single case. People begin asking whether these long-standing definitions are still practical, or if they're simply outdated. Some argue that traditions exist for a reason, especially when it comes to institutions built on continuity and clear rules. From that perspective, changing definitions too quickly could create confusion or even weaken the structure itself. Others see it differently. They believe that if laws don't evolve alongside society, they risk becoming irrelevant. Modern families don't always fit into historical definitions, and legal systems eventually have to acknowledge that reality. And that tension between tradition and change is exactly what keeps this conversation alive, not just in courtrooms, but across media, public opinion, and ongoing debates like the one you're watching right now on Throneza. And this is where the conversation becomes far more sensitive and far more complex.
See, when William was born and Harry was born and George and Charlotte and Louis, we got great pictures outside the hospital. I remember, and William and Catherine especially, they made such an effort to show the whole world their new baby.
Because when a high-value inheritance case can raise questions about how existing laws apply to modern family situations, it naturally leads some people to wonder how similar principles function in much older, more rigid systems. But it's important to be precise here. Any discussion about constitutional matters, especially something as significant as the line of succession, is governed by clearly defined legal processes and official documentation. These are not decisions shaped by speculation, but by formal recognition and established law. Still, debates like this tend to expand beyond the original case. They move into hypothetical territory, where people begin asking what-if questions. Not because there is confirmed evidence, but because the legal conversation itself opens the door to broader interpretation. And that's why this topic keeps gaining attention. Not necessarily because answers have been proven, but because the questions themselves are enough to keep the discussion going, with different sides interpreting the same situation in completely different ways. And this is where the conversation starts to shift again. Comments that may have once been dismissed or overlooked are now being revisited, not necessarily as proof, but as part of a much wider discussion. With cases like the Marquis of Bath gaining attention in major outlets, the focus has moved beyond personal claims and into how laws themselves are interpreted. People aren't just looking at timelines anymore. They're looking at legal language, historical definitions, and how those definitions are applied today. But it's important to separate two things. One is a private legal case dealing with inheritance law. The other is the constitutional framework that governs the monarchy, which operates under its own established rules and official processes. Still, the overlap in terminology, phrases that date back centuries, has sparked curiosity and debate. Not because conclusions have been confirmed, but because the same language can raise similar questions in different contexts.
Maybe King Charles didn't want to do anything about it given what's going on with Andrew, but in order for William to save the monarchy, he has to deal with the Archie and Lilibet problem.
And that's what keeps this topic active. Not definitive answers, but the ongoing discussion about how old systems interact with modern realities. And this is where the tone of the conversation becomes more intense. Some critics argue that the response to past claims has often come through legal channels rather than detailed public explanations. From their perspective, that approach raises questions about transparency. But it's also important to look at the other side. Public figures, especially ones under constant scrutiny, frequently rely on legal teams to handle claims they consider inaccurate or invasive. In many cases, that's standard practice, not necessarily an admission of anything. Still, the contrast hasn't gone unnoticed. People point out that while certain aspects of personal life have been openly shared in interviews, documentaries, and memoirs, other topics remain private or unaddressed. That difference in openness is what continues to fuel discussion online. And in situations like this, the absence of a direct, detailed response often leads to even more speculation, whether that speculation is justified or not. And this is where opinions really start to split. Some critics argue that certain personal details have been shared very openly over the years, while other topics remain private, and that contrast is what keeps raising questions. From their perspective, it's not about demanding every detail. It's about consistency in what is addressed and what isn't. At the same time, others push back on that idea entirely. They believe that family matters, especially involving children, deserve a clear boundary regardless of public status. In that view, privacy isn't suspicious, it's necessary. So the debate continues from both sides. And then there's the broader perspective. Some observers suggest that figures like Prince William are simply navigating a situation they didn't create, but may eventually have to respond to in some form as public interest continues to grow. Whether anything actually changes or not is still unclear. But what is clear is that the conversation isn't going away anytime soon. And this is where the contrast becomes part of the wider conversation. Some observers see a clear difference in how situations are handled. On one side, there are cases that unfold publicly through courts and legal processes, where every step is documented and open to scrutiny. On the other, there are situations managed more privately, often through legal teams and controlled communication. Critics interpret that difference as a question of transparency. Supporters, however, see it as a difference in circumstance, arguing that not every situation requires public disclosure, especially when it involves family and personal matters. And that divide in perception is what keeps audiences engaged. Longtime royal watchers often compare current events to past moments they remember clearly. Public appearances, major milestones, and the way information was traditionally shared. Whether fair or not, those comparisons shape how people interpret what they're seeing now. And ultimately, it's that contrast between expectation and reality that continues to drive the conversation forward. A monarchy built on tradition has weathered countless challenges over time. Controversy, personal conflicts, and major public scrutiny. Those things, historically, haven't been enough to shake its foundation. But what tends to draw the most attention is uncertainty. Not confirmed facts, but ongoing questions, debates, and differing interpretations that continue to circulate without clear resolution. That's what keeps conversations like this alive. At the same time, it's important to recognize that public discussion doesn't always reflect verified reality. There's a difference between what is officially documented and what is debated online, and that line can sometimes get blurred. Still, one thing is certain. The more people look into stories like this, the more perspectives emerge, and the conversation only grows. That's exactly why topics like this continue to gain traction across media and platforms. If you've been following along, you already know these discussions rarely end in one video. So if you want to stay updated as new angles, new claims, and new context appear, make sure you're subscribed to Throneza and turn on notifications, because the next breakdown goes even deeper into what's being said and what actually holds up.